At my birthday party, my drunk mother-in-law accidentally blurted out, "You know that's not your biological daughter, right?" while laughing hysterically. I never thought my 35th birthday would become the day that changed everything. What started as a typical celebration with family and friends in our backyard quickly transformed into the moment I discovered that my entire life had been built on deception. My name is Dorian, and this is the story of how one careless comment from my mother-in-law revealed a truth that had been hidden from me for 8 years, and how I orchestrated the most calculated response that left my wife Sally scrambling to salvage the wreckage of her lies. The party was winding down when it happened. Most of the guests had already left, and only close family remained scattered around our patio. Sally's mother, Blair, had been sampling the wine a bit too liberally throughout the evening, becoming increasingly animated with each glass. My daughter Holly, who had just turned 8 last month, was playing with her cousins near the pool while the adults sat around the fire pit sharing stories and laughing. Everything seemed perfect, exactly the kind of peaceful family gathering I had always treasured. Blair was in the middle of telling an embarrassing story about Sally's teenage years when she suddenly paused, looking directly at me with glassy eyes and a mischievous grin. That should have been my first warning sign. She had this habit of saying inappropriate things when she drank, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "You know, Dorian," she said, her words slightly slurred but crystal clear, "you're such a good father to Holly. It's amazing how much you love her, considering." She trailed off, giggling uncontrollably. "Considering what, Mom?" Sally asked sharply, her voice carrying a warning tone that I had never heard before. The conversation around the fire pit had gone quiet, and I could feel the tension building like electricity in the air. Blair waved her hand dismissively, still laughing as if she had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Oh, you know," Blair continued, completely oblivious to the horror growing on her daughter's face, "that she's not actually his biological daughter." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the world tilt on its axis as my brain struggled to process what I had just heard. Holly, my precious little girl who had my eyes according to everyone, who called me daddy and made me Father's Day cards every year, wasn't mine. I turned to look at Sally, searching her face for some indication that this was all a horrible misunderstanding or one of Blair's inappropriate jokes taken too far. Instead, I saw pure panic in her eyes. She was nervously laughing, but it sounded forced and desperate, like someone trying to convince themselves that a house fire wasn't really happening. "Mom, stop it," she said frantically, reaching over to grab Blair's wine glass. "You need to stop talking right now." But Blair was on a roll now, seemingly delighted by the chaos she had unleashed. "What? It's not like it's a secret anymore," she said with another burst of laughter. "I mean, Thaddeus knows, right? You told him eventually?" The mention of another man's name hit me like a physical blow. Thaddeus. I knew that name. He was Sally's co-worker from her previous job, the one she had mentioned casually in conversations years ago. The one she had claimed was just a friend when I had noticed her texting him frequently. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Sally's sudden decision to move in with me so quickly after we started dating. Her insistence that we get married before Holly was born. The way she had always deflected questions about Holly's biological father, claiming he was a random guy who wanted nothing to do with them. The mysterious child support payments that never materialized despite her claims that she was pursuing them. All of it had been lies, carefully constructed to hide the truth that my daughter wasn't my daughter at all. I stood up slowly, feeling remarkably calm despite the emotional tornado raging inside my chest. Everyone was staring at me now, waiting for my reaction. Sally looked like she was about to be sick, her face pale and her hands shaking as she tried to salvage the situation. "Dorian, please, let me explain," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Thank you for finally telling me the truth after all these years of lies," I said quietly, looking directly at Blair. My voice was steady, almost conversational, which seemed to unnerve everyone more than if I had started screaming. I could see the confusion in Blair's eyes as she began to realize what she had done. The laughter had died on her lips, replaced by a look of dawning horror. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the house. Behind me, I could hear Sally calling my name, her voice rising to a near panic as she realized I was leaving. "Dorian, wait. Please, we need to talk about this." But I kept walking, my footsteps echoing on the wooden deck as I made my way through the sliding door and into our kitchen. I grabbed my keys from the counter and headed for the front door, ignoring Sally's increasingly desperate pleas for me to stay and discuss what had happened. "It's not what you think," she was saying, but we both knew that was another lie. It was exactly what I thought, and probably worse than I could imagine. 8 years of deception, 8 years of playing the role of the devoted father to a child who wasn't mine, 8 years of believing I was living an authentic life with a woman I loved. I drove around the neighborhood for about 10 minutes, my mind racing as I tried to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. I had always been a measured person, someone who thought through problems logically before reacting. This situation would require that same approach, but magnified 1,000 times over. I pulled into a parking lot and sat in my car, staring at my phone as I considered my next move. The truth was out now, but I needed to understand the full scope of the deception before I decided how to respond. I opened my laptop, which I had grabbed from my home office on the way out, and began to methodically piece together the timeline of lies that had shaped my entire adult life. The first thing I did was access our joint financial accounts to see if there were any irregularities I had missed over the years. What I found made my blood run cold. There were regular transfers from an account I didn't recognize, always for the same amount, always on the 15th of each month. The transfers had been happening for the entire duration of our marriage, disguised in our statements as family support payments that I had assumed were from Sally's parents. I cross-referenced the account number with a reverse lookup tool I found online and discovered it belonged to Thaddeus Blackwood. Not only was he Holly's biological father, but he had apparently been paying child support this entire time. Sally had been collecting money from both of us, letting me believe I was the father while secretly maintaining a financial relationship with the actual father. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. I found text messages on Sally's old phone, which she had given to Holly to use for games, that revealed an ongoing relationship with Thaddeus that extended far beyond simple co-parenting. They had been meeting regularly for coffee, coordinating their stories to ensure I never discovered the truth, and planning for a future that apparently didn't include me. One particular message thread from just 6 months ago made my hands shake with rage. Sally had written to Thaddeus, "Dorian is getting suspicious about the support payments. I think we need to phase them out soon. Maybe after Holly turns 10? His response was equally damning, "Just a few more years and we can tell her the truth." I hate watching another man raise my daughter, but the timing isn't right yet. They had been planning to reveal the truth eventually, but on their terms and their timeline. I was just a convenient placeholder father until they decided I was no longer needed. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. I had loved Holly with every fiber of my being, had shaped my entire life around being the best father I could be, and it had all been part of an elaborate deception. By the time I had finished my investigation, nearly 3 hours had passed. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and texts from Sally, each message more frantic than the last. I ignored them all as I crafted my response. This wouldn't be an emotional outburst or angry confrontation. This would be surgical, precise, and devastating. I started by taking screenshots of every piece of evidence I had found, organizing them into a comprehensive folder that told the complete story of their deception. The financial records, the text messages, the timeline of lies, everything was documented and ready to be shared with the appropriate people. Next, I researched my legal options regarding paternity fraud and discovered that I had grounds for not only dissolving the marriage but also recovering the financial support I had provided under false pretenses. I made note of several attorneys who specialized in these types of cases and scheduled consultations for the following week. But the real masterpiece of my response was what I planned to send to Sally. I opened a new email and began to type, choosing each word carefully to maximize the impact of my message. This wouldn't just be about ending our marriage, this would be about exposing the truth to everyone who had been part of the lie, whether they knew it or not. The email I crafted was a work of art in its brutal efficiency. I started with a simple statement: "I know the truth about Holly's paternity, and I have evidence of your 8-year deception." Then I laid out everything I had discovered, complete with screenshots and documentation. But the real devastation came in the final paragraphs, where I detailed my next steps. I explained that I would be filing for divorce immediately and pursuing legal action for paternity fraud. I informed her that I had already contacted a forensic accountant to calculate the exact amount of financial support I had provided under false pretenses, which I would be seeking to recover through the courts. But most importantly, I told her that I would be sharing the truth with both of our families, our mutual friends, and anyone else who had been deceived by her lies. The final line of the email was the one that I knew would haunt her: "Since you and Thaddeus have been planning to tell Holly the truth eventually anyway, I've decided to accelerate your timeline. She deserves to know who her real father is, and I deserve to be free from this web of lies you've trapped me in." I attached all of the evidence I had gathered and included Thaddeus in the email recipients, along with both sets of parents and several close friends who had been present at birthday parties and family gatherings over the years. With one click, I would be exposing the truth to everyone who mattered in our social circle. But before I sent it, I sat in my car for another hour, making sure this was really what I wanted to do. Part of me still loved Holly deeply, regardless of her biological parentage, and I knew that my actions would inevitably hurt her. But I also knew that continuing to live a lie wasn't fair to any of us, including her. She deserved to know her real father, and I deserved to build a life based on truth rather than deception. At 11:47 p.m., I pressed send. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing within seconds, and it didn't stop for the next hour. Sally called 17 times in the first 10 minutes, followed by calls from her parents, my parents, and several friends who had been included in the email blast. I let them all go to voicemail, savoring the chaos I had unleashed with surgical precision. The voicemails were exactly what I had expected. Sally's messages started out angry and defensive, accusing me of overreacting and destroying our family over something that didn't really matter. But as the evening progressed and she realized the full scope of what I had exposed, her tone shifted to desperate pleading. She begged me to come home so we could work things out, promised that she would explain everything, and swore that she had always loved me despite the deception. The messages from her parents were particularly satisfying. Blair, now apparently sober enough to understand what she had done, left a tearful voicemail apologizing for her careless words and begging me to forgive her daughter. Sally's father, Marcus, was less apologetic and more focused on damage control, suggesting that we could all work through this as a family if I would just come home and stop embarrassing everyone. But it was the message from Thaddeus that provided the most insight into just how deep the deception had run. His voicemail was carefully worded, clearly crafted by someone who knew he was in serious legal trouble. He claimed that he had always respected my role as Holly's father and had never intended to interfere with our family. The lies came so naturally to him that I almost admired his audacity. I spent the night in a hotel, finally turning off my phone around 2 a.m. when the constant ringing became unbearable. I needed time to think and plan my next moves without the distraction of their desperate attempts to contact me. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, I dreamed of a future free from the weight of deception that had been crushing me for years without my knowledge. The next morning brought a new wave of revelations as I began to receive responses from people who had been included in my email blast. Several friends reached out to offer their support and share their own suspicions about Sally's behavior over the years. Apparently, I hadn't been as oblivious as I thought. Others had noticed inconsistencies in her stories and strange behavior around the topic of Holly's paternity. My sister Isadora was particularly helpful. I thought about saying something several times. She told me during a phone call, but I didn't want to cause problems if I was wrong. The most shocking revelation came from my neighbor, Fitzgerald, who had been present at the birthday party and witnessed the whole disaster unfold. He called to tell me that he had seen Thaddeus parked down the street during several of our family gatherings over the years, apparently watching from a distance. I always assumed he was just some weird guy, Fitzgerald explained, but now it makes perfect sense. He was watching his daughter grow up from afar. As the day progressed, I began to understand that my response had been even more effective than I had hoped. The truth was spreading through our social circle like wildfire, and Sally was discovering that keeping her lies straight was impossible when everyone suddenly had access to the facts. People were asking questions she couldn't answer, demanding explanations for behavior that now seemed obviously deceptive in hindsight. By late afternoon, I had received a call from my attorney confirming that I had strong grounds for both divorce and paternity fraud claims. The evidence I had gathered was more than sufficient to prove that Sally had knowingly deceived me about Holly's parentage for financial gain. The forensic accountant estimated that I had provided over $180,000 in direct support for Holly over the years, not including the countless indirect costs of supporting a family under false pretenses. But the real satisfaction came from watching Sally's carefully constructed world of lies collapse in real time. Her social media accounts, which had been filled with happy family photos and glowing tributes to our perfect life, suddenly went silent. Mutual friends were posting pointed questions and comments that made it clear the truth was out and spreading rapidly. The calls and texts continued relentlessly throughout the day. Sally's messages became increasingly desperate as she realized that her damage control efforts were failing spectacularly. She offered to move out immediately if I would just agree to keep the truth private. She promised to pay back every penny of child support I had provided. She even offered to have Thaddeus formally acknowledge paternity and take full financial responsibility for Holly going forward. But it was too late for negotiations. The truth was out, the legal process was already in motion, and I had no interest in protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. For 8 years, she had made unilateral decisions about my life based on lies and deception. Now it was my turn to make unilateral decisions based on truth and justice. The most difficult part of the entire situation was dealing with Holly herself. She was old enough to understand that something serious was happening but too young to fully comprehend the adult complexities of paternity and deception. When Sally finally brought her by the hotel to see me 2 days after the birthday party disaster, my heart broke all over again. "Daddy, why won't you come home?" she asked, her innocent eyes filled with confusion and hurt. I had to fight back tears as I tried to explain that sometimes adults make mistakes that require big changes, and that none of this was her fault. I promised her that I would always love her, regardless of what happened between her mother and me, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the full truth just yet. That conversation reinforced my resolve to handle the situation with as much dignity as possible. Holly didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of her mother's lies, but she also deserved to know the truth about her biological father. I decided to work with a family counselor to help navigate the revelation process in a way that would minimize the trauma for her. While I was dealing with the emotional complexities of my relationship with Holly, my investigation into Sally's deception was revealing even more disturbing details. I had hired a private investigator named Octavius to help me uncover the full scope of the lies I had been living with. What he discovered went far beyond simple paternity fraud and painted a picture of systematic deception that spanned our entire relationship. The first major revelation came when Octavius traced the timeline of Sally's relationship with Thaddeus. They hadn't just been co-workers who had a brief affair resulting in pregnancy. They had been in a serious relationship for over 2 years before she met me, and their breakup had been temporary rather than permanent. According to his investigation, they had been trying to make their relationship work while she was pregnant with Holly, but financial pressures and Thaddeus's reluctance to commit had driven them apart. This was when Sally had apparently decided to find a more stable partner to help raise her child. The private investigator had uncovered evidence suggesting that she had specifically targeted me because of my stable career and obvious desire for a family. Messages he found in her old social media accounts revealed conversations with friends where she had described her strategy of finding someone who would step up and be a real father while she figured out her situation with Thaddeus. The calculated nature of her approach was breathtaking in its cynicism. She had researched my background, learned about my interests, and crafted a persona designed to appeal to exactly what I was looking for in a partner. Even our chance meeting at the bookstore downtown had been orchestrated after she learned about my habit of browsing there every Saturday morning. The woman I had fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed illusion from the very beginning. But the most devastating discovery was that Sally and Thaddeus had never actually ended their relationship entirely. While I was playing the role of devoted husband and father, they had been maintaining a secret connection that went far beyond co-parenting arrangements. The private investigator had uncovered evidence of regular meetings, romantic correspondence, and even weekend trips that Sally had disguised as girls' weekends or work conferences. Octavius presented me with a folder containing photographs, credit card records, and phone logs that painted a clear picture of ongoing infidelity throughout our marriage. The betrayal went so much deeper than I had initially understood, encompassing not just paternity fraud but years of active deception and adultery. The financial records were equally shocking. In addition to the child support payments I had already discovered, there were numerous other financial transactions between Sally and Thaddeus that suggested a much more complex arrangement than simple support payments. There were payments going in both directions, suggesting that Sally had been financially supporting Thaddeus during periods when he was unemployed or struggling. Armed with this new evidence, I realized that my initial response, while satisfying, had only scratched the surface of the deception I had been living with. I decided to expand my strategy to ensure that the full scope of their betrayal was exposed to everyone who needed to know the truth. This wouldn't just be about paternity fraud anymore, this would be about holding them accountable for years of systematic deception and financial manipulation. I scheduled another meeting with my attorney to discuss the additional evidence and explore expanded legal options. The adultery charges would strengthen my divorce case significantly, and the evidence of financial manipulation opened up new avenues for recovery. More importantly, the pattern of deception would make it much harder for Sally to claim that she had been acting out of good intentions or trying to protect anyone. The private investigator had also uncovered information about Thaddeus that added another layer of complexity to the situation. Apparently, he was married to someone else during the early years of his secret relationship with Sally. His wife, Persephone, had divorced him 3 years ago after discovering his infidelity, but she had never known about Holly or the ongoing financial arrangements. Octavia suggested that she might be interested in learning about the child support payments that had been coming out of Thaddeus's income during their marriage. This revelation opened up an entirely new front in my campaign for truth and justice. Persephone had been another victim of their deception, unknowingly subsidizing Thaddeus's secret family while believing she was in a monogamous marriage. I decided to reach out to her with the evidence I had gathered, both as a courtesy and as a way to potentially strengthen my legal case by demonstrating the broader pattern of deception that surrounded Thaddeus and Sally's relationship. The conversation with Persephone was enlightening and heartbreaking. She had suspected that Thaddeus was having an affair during the later years of their marriage, but she had never imagined the scope of his deception. When I showed her the evidence of the ongoing relationship with Sally and the existence of Holly, she was devastated but also grateful to finally understand what had really been happening during those confusing final years of her marriage. Persephone agreed to provide testimony and evidence from her own divorce proceedings that would support my case against both Sally and Thaddeus. She had financial records showing suspicious expenses and withdrawals that now made perfect sense in the context of his secret family obligations. More importantly, she had documentation of lies Thaddeus had told during their divorce proceedings about his income and expenses, which could potentially constitute perjury if he had hidden the child support payments. As word of these new revelations spread through our extended social circle, the response was even more dramatic than my initial email blast had generated. People who had initially been willing to give Sally the benefit of the doubt began to understand that her deception had been far more extensive and calculated than anyone had realized. The narrative of a young mother trying to provide stability for her child was replaced by the reality of a woman who had systematically deceived multiple people for years while maintaining an elaborate double life. The most satisfying response came from Sally's own family as they began to piece together their daughter's behavior over the years. Her father Marcus called me personally to apologize and express his horror at the full scope of what she had done. He admitted that they had suspected something wasn't quite right about her stories over the years, but they had attributed the inconsistencies to the stress of single motherhood and had chosen to support her rather than ask difficult questions. Blair, despite her role in accidentally exposing the truth, was perhaps the most devastated by the revelations about her daughter's behavior. She left me a voicemail that was so full of genuine remorse and shame that I almost felt sorry for her. "I thought I was just keeping a family secret," she said through tears, "but I realize now that I was helping her deceive you and that precious little girl. I failed as a mother by not teaching her better values, and I failed you by not speaking up sooner." The impact on Sally herself was becoming increasingly apparent as her carefully constructed world continued to collapse. Friends and family members who had initially been supportive began to distance themselves as the full scope of her deception became clear. Her social media accounts, which had been silent since my initial revelation, suddenly became active again as she attempted to control the narrative and portray herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. But her attempts at damage control only made things worse. Every explanation she offered was contradicted by the evidence that was now circulating among our mutual acquaintances. Every claim of innocence or misunderstanding was met with documented proof of deliberate deception. She had lost the ability to control the story, and her desperate attempts to regain that control only highlighted the calculated nature of her original lies. The legal proceedings were moving forward rapidly, aided by the overwhelming amount of evidence and the cooperation of multiple witnesses who had been affected by the deception. My attorney was confident that we would not only recover the full amount of financial support I had provided under false pretenses but also additional damages for the emotional distress and the systematic nature of the fraud. Thaddeus, meanwhile, was facing his own legal challenges as the evidence of his perjury during his divorce from Persephone came to light. His attempts to minimize his involvement in the deception were undermined by the extensive documentation of his active participation in maintaining the lies. The man who had been content to watch from the shadows while another man raised his daughter was now facing the full consequences of his cowardice and dishonesty. But perhaps the most significant development was the effect that all of this truth-telling was having on Holly herself. Working with the family counselor, we had begun to help her understand the complex situation surrounding her parentage. To my amazement, she seemed to handle the revelation better than any of the adults involved. Children, it seems, have a remarkable capacity for accepting truth when it's presented to them with love and support. "So I have two daddies now?" she asked during one of our counseling sessions. When I explained that Thaddeus was her biological father while I had been her daddy by choice for 8 years, she simply nodded and asked if this meant she would get more birthday presents. Her resilience and adaptability reminded me why I had fought so hard to ensure that the truth came out in a way that prioritized her well-being over everyone else's comfort. The relationship between Holly and Thaddeus was developing slowly but positively. He had been genuinely remorseful about missing the first 8 years of her life and was committed to building a real father-daughter relationship going forward. While I had mixed feelings about the man who had allowed me to unknowingly raise his child, I had to admit that his dedication to being a better father now was genuine and beneficial for Holly. As the months passed, I began to see the full impact of my decision to respond to deception with systematic truth-telling rather than emotional retaliation. Sally's life had been completely transformed, but not through any malicious action on my part. I had simply refused to continue participating in her lies and had ensured that everyone else had access to the same truth I had discovered. The consequences she faced were entirely the result of her own choices and actions. The financial judgment against her was substantial, but it was the social and emotional consequences that seemed to affect her most deeply. She had lost the respect of her family, the support of her friends, and the comfortable life she had built through deception. More importantly, she had lost the moral authority to guide and influence Holly's development, as her daughter now understood that her mother was someone who had chosen lies over truth for years. In contrast, my own life was flourishing in ways I hadn't expected. The authenticity and integrity that now characterized all of my relationships had created a foundation for genuine happiness and fulfillment. I had begun dating again, but this time with a much clearer understanding of what I was looking for and what I would not tolerate. The experience with Sally had taught me to trust my instincts and to prioritize honesty above all other considerations in my relationships. The professional consequences for both Sally and Thaddeus were also significant. Word of their deception had spread through their professional networks, damaging their reputations and limiting their career opportunities. Sally had been passed over for a promotion she had been expecting, with her supervisor later admitting privately that concerns about her integrity had influenced the decision. Thaddeus had lost several consulting contracts when his clients learned about his involvement in the paternity fraud case. These professional consequences weren't something I had deliberately sought, but they were natural results of the truth coming to light. People in business, like people in personal relationships, prefer to work with individuals they can trust. When someone's capacity for systematic deception becomes publicly known, it inevitably affects their professional reputation and opportunities. One of the most unexpected developments in this entire saga came when I received a call from another man named Lysander. He reached out because he suspected that he might be in a similar situation with his own wife and believed that Sally might have information that could help him uncover the truth about his circumstances. Lysander's story was eerily similar to mine, involving a woman named Ophelia who had moved in with him quickly after they started dating, bringing along a young son she claimed was from a previous relationship that had ended badly. Like me, he had never questioned the story and had embraced his role as a stepfather, providing financial and emotional support for a child he loved deeply. But inconsistencies in Ophelia's stories and suspicious behavior around certain topics had begun to raise questions in his mind. What made his situation particularly relevant to mine was that Ophelia and Sally had been close friends during college and had maintained their friendship over the years. Lysander suspected that they might have shared strategies for managing their complex romantic situations, or even coordinated their deceptions to avoid detection. He asked if I would be willing to share some of the investigative techniques I had used to uncover the truth about my own situation. I agreed to help Lysander, both because I sympathized with his position and because I was curious about whether Sally's deception was part of a broader pattern involving other people. We arranged to meet with my private investigator, Octavius, who was intrigued by the possibility that we might be dealing with a more extensive network of deception than we had originally realized. The investigation into Lysander's situation quickly revealed that his suspicions were well-founded. Ophelia had indeed been lying about her son's paternity, and more disturbing, there was evidence that she and Sally had been in regular contact throughout their respective relationships, sharing advice and strategies for maintaining their deceptions. Phone records showed frequent calls between them, often occurring right after they had close calls or suspicious questions from their partners. This discovery led to an expanded investigation that uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior involving both women and potentially others in their social circle. They had apparently developed a sophisticated system for supporting each other's lies, providing alibis when needed, and sharing techniques for manipulating their partner's emotions and suspicions. What I had initially thought was an isolated case of personal betrayal was actually part of a calculated approach to exploiting men's desire for family and stability. The evidence of this broader conspiracy added another dimension to my legal case against Sally. It demonstrated that her deception hadn't been a desperate decision made by a frightened young mother, but rather a premeditated strategy developed and refined through collaboration with others engaged in similar deceptions. This pattern of behavior would make it much more difficult for her to claim that she had acted out of good intentions or desperation. Lysander's discovery of the truth about his own situation provided an additional source of evidence about the methods these women had used to maintain their deceptions. They had created elaborate support networks designed to validate each other's lies and provide cover when their stories began to unravel. They had even developed contingency plans for handling various scenarios, including what to do if their deceptions were discovered by their partners. As news of this expanded network of deception spread through our community, other men began to come forward with similar stories and suspicions. It became clear that Sally and Ophelia were not isolated cases but rather part of a broader phenomenon that had affected multiple families in our area. The scope of the deception was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. This revelation transformed what had started as a personal quest for truth and justice into something much larger. I found myself inadvertently leading a group of men who had been victimized by similar deceptions, all of us working together to expose the truth and hold the responsible parties accountable. The support and validation I received from these other men was unexpectedly healing, as it helped me understand that I wasn't alone in having been deceived and manipulated. The legal implications of discovering this broader pattern of deception were significant. My attorney was able to argue that Sally's actions were part of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, which carried much more severe penalties than simple paternity fraud. The evidence of coordination and premeditation made it impossible for her to claim that her actions had been isolated mistakes or desperate decisions made under pressure. The media attention that began to surround our case was something I hadn't anticipated but found oddly satisfying. Sally found herself at the center of a public scandal that made her personal shame and humiliation much more intense than it would have been if the situation had remained private. The impact on the other families involved was varied but generally positive in terms of revealing truth and ending deception. Some of the men, like Lysander, were grateful to finally understand what had been happening in their relationships and were able to begin the process of rebuilding their lives on a foundation of honesty. Others were more reluctant to accept the truth, having become so invested in their false families that they preferred to continue living with the lies rather than face the painful reality. But for those of us who chose to embrace the truth, the process of recovery and rebuilding was remarkably empowering. We had formed an informal support group that met regularly to share experiences, offer advice, and provide emotional support during the difficult process of legal proceedings and family restructuring. The bonds we formed through our shared experience of betrayal and recovery became some of the strongest and most meaningful relationships in our lives. The investigation also revealed that the deception network had been operating for much longer than any of us had realized. Evidence suggested that similar strategies had been used by women in this group for over a decade, with newer participants being recruited and trained by more experienced practitioners. The systematic nature of their approach was both impressive and deeply disturbing, representing a level of organized deception that went far beyond anything I had initially imagined. As the investigation deepened, we discovered that the network had even maintained detailed records of their activities. Octavius had uncovered a series of encrypted files on Sally's computer that contained what could only be described as training materials and case studies. These documents outlined specific techniques for identifying and targeting potential victims, methods for maintaining long-term deceptions, and strategies for dealing with suspicious partners or close calls. The level of sophistication was staggering. They had created profiles of different types of men and the approaches that worked best with each personality type. There were detailed instructions on how to research potential targets using social media and public records, guidelines for crafting believable backstories, and even scripts for handling difficult conversations about paternity and relationship history. It was like discovering a manual for emotional warfare disguised as relationship advice. One particularly disturbing document was titled Emergency Protocols and contained step-by-step instructions for what to do if a deception was discovered or in danger of being exposed. The recommendations included gaslighting techniques to make the victim question their own perceptions, methods for recruiting friends and family to support false narratives, and even suggestions for creating false evidence to support lies that were being questioned. The document also contained contingency plans for various scenarios, including what they called controlled revelations, situations where they would strategically reveal partial truths to deflect attention from larger deceptions. Reading these materials made me realize that even Blair's drunken revelation at my birthday party might have been part of a larger strategy, though the evidence suggested it was more likely a genuine accident that derailed their carefully laid plans. Perhaps most chilling was a section on target retention that provided advice on how to keep victims emotionally invested in relationships even after they became suspicious. The techniques included love bombing during periods of doubt, creating artificial crises that required the victim's support and protection, and using children as emotional leverage to prevent partners from leaving or asking too many questions. Reading these materials felt like discovering that I had been living inside an elaborate psychological experiment for 8 years. Every tender moment, every crisis we had weathered together, every declaration of love and commitment had been filtered through this calculated framework designed to manipulate my emotions and maintain my compliance with their deception. The violation went so much deeper than simple lies about paternity. It was a complete reconstruction of my reality based on their strategic objectives. The discovery of these materials also revealed that the network had been keeping detailed records of their financial gains from various relationships. They tracked child support payments, gifts, household contributions, and other forms of financial support they had extracted from their victims. The documents showed that Sally alone had collected over $300,000 from me during our relationship when all forms of support were calculated, while simultaneously receiving money from Thaddeus and maintaining her own independent income. But the financial tracking went beyond simple accounting. They had developed sophisticated models for maximizing their extraction of resources while minimizing their risk of detection. They calculated optimal timelines for major relationship milestones, identified the most effective times to introduce additional financial obligations, and even analyzed which types of expenses were least likely to trigger suspicion from their partners. The network had also been sharing information about legal vulnerabilities and law enforcement responses to paternity fraud cases. They maintained files on attorneys, judges, and law enforcement personnel in our area, along with assessments of how sympathetic each might be to claims of deception versus claims of victimization. This level of preparation suggested that they had anticipated the possibility of legal consequences and had been developing strategies to minimize their exposure. As this evidence was presented to law enforcement, it became clear that we were dealing with something that went far beyond civil disputes over paternity and divorce. The coordinated nature of their activities, the systematic deception, and the financial gains involved suggested that criminal charges might be appropriate. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into potential charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, organized criminal activity, and racketeering. The criminal investigation brought a new level of scrutiny to Sally's activities and those of her associates. Search warrants were executed on multiple homes and offices, uncovering even more evidence of their coordinated deception. The women who had been so confident in their ability to manipulate and control their victims suddenly found themselves facing the full power of the criminal justice system. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of the victims, but it also sparked broader conversations about trust, deception, and vulnerability in modern relationships. For Sally personally, the transformation from respected community member to criminal defendant was swift and devastating. She had lost her job due to the negative publicity, been evicted from her apartment when she couldn't make rent payments, and was facing the possibility of significant prison time if convicted on the criminal charges. The comfortable life she had built through deception had completely collapsed, leaving her with nothing but legal bills and public shame. Her attempts to generate sympathy or portray herself as a victim had been completely undermined by the discovery of the training materials and financial records. It was impossible to claim that she had been acting out of desperation or good intentions when the evidence showed years of calculated planning and coordination with others engaged in similar activities. The jury of public opinion had already reached a verdict, and it was overwhelmingly against her. Thaddeus faced his own set of criminal charges related to his knowing participation in the deception and his perjury during his divorce proceedings. His attempts to distance himself from Sally and claim that he had been manipulated were contradicted by evidence showing his active participation in planning and maintaining the lies. The man who had been content to lurk in the shadows while another man raised his daughter was now facing intense public scrutiny and potential imprisonment. The impact on their extended families was profound and lasting. Sally's parents, particularly her mother Blair, were struggling with intense guilt and shame about their daughter's behavior and their own role in enabling it. They had mortgaged their home to help pay for Sally's legal defense, and the financial strain was adding to their emotional distress. The family unity they had maintained for decades was fracturing under the weight of truth and consequence. Thaddeus's family faced similar challenges, particularly his elderly parents who had been looking forward to finally meeting their granddaughter under normal circumstances. Instead, they found themselves associated with a criminal case and public scandal that made any relationship with Holly extremely complicated. The joy of discovering they had a granddaughter was overshadowed by the circumstances of that discovery and the behavior of their son. For the children involved in these cases, including Holly, the situation required careful management by family counselors and child psychologists. While children are often more resilient than adults in adapting to changed circumstances, the discovery that their entire family history had been built on lies created unique challenges that required professional intervention. Rather than being traumatized by learning the truth, she seemed relieved to finally have honest answers to questions that had been troubling her. Her relationship with Thaddeus was developing slowly but positively, aided by professional guidance and my own commitment to supporting what was best for her regardless of my personal feelings about him. While I would never forgive him for his role in deceiving me, I recognized that Holly deserved to have a relationship with her biological father, and I was determined not to let my anger interfere with that possibility. The therapeutic process also helped me understand some of my own vulnerabilities that had made me susceptible to Sally's manipulation. I had been so eager to find love and create a family that I had ignored red flags and rationalized away inconsistencies that should have prompted more questions. Learning to trust my instincts and maintain appropriate boundaries became an important part of my recovery process. As the criminal cases moved through the legal system, more details emerged about the scope and sophistication of the deception network. It became clear that they had been operating across multiple states and had potentially victimized dozens of men over the years. The FBI became involved in the investigation, treating it as a case of organized fraud that crossed state lines and involved significant financial crimes. The federal investigation revealed connections to other forms of fraud and identity theft that the network had been engaged in beyond their relationship-based deceptions. They had been using their access to their victims' personal information to commit credit fraud, had been filing false tax returns, and had even been involved in insurance fraud schemes. The romantic manipulation had been just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise. This escalation to federal criminal charges meant that Sally and her associates were facing the possibility of decades in prison rather than the relatively light sentences they might have received for simple paternity fraud. The stakes had increased dramatically, and their previous confidence in their ability to manipulate the situation through emotional appeals and claims of victimization was no longer viable. The discovery of the broader criminal enterprise also validated my decision to respond to their deception with systematic investigation rather than emotional confrontation. If I had simply walked away from the relationship without uncovering the truth, Sally and her network would have continued victimizing other men indefinitely. By choosing to expose the truth comprehensively, I had potentially prevented countless other families from experiencing the same deception and trauma. The support group that had formed among the victims became an important source of strength and validation as we navigated the complex legal proceedings and media attention. We had all experienced similar forms of manipulation and gaslighting, and having others who truly understood what we had been through was invaluable in maintaining our confidence in the truth despite ongoing attempts by the defendants to muddy the waters and create doubt. The legal proceedings were well underway. I had filed for divorce citing fraud and irreconcilable differences, and my attorney had begun the process of pursuing financial recovery for the paternity fraud. Thaddeus, apparently on the advice of his own lawyer, had finally acknowledged his biological relationship to Holly and agreed to begin formal child support payments. The most satisfying development was watching Sally struggle to explain her behavior to our families and friends. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim who had been trying to protect everyone fell flat when confronted with the evidence of deliberate, long-term deception. Her own mother, Blair, publicly apologized to me for her role in maintaining the lies and expressed her shame at her daughter's behavior. The divorce proceedings moved quickly once the paternity issue was established through DNA testing. Sally couldn't contest the fraud charges in the face of overwhelming evidence, and her attorney advised her to cooperate fully in hopes of minimizing the financial judgment against her. The court ordered her to repay $127,000 in child support I had provided, plus legal fees and interest. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was the way the truth had liberated everyone from the web of lies that had constrained us for so long. Thaddeus was finally able to openly acknowledge his relationship with Holly and begin building a real father-daughter relationship. Holly, after working with a family counselor, seemed to adapt remarkably well to having two fathers who both loved her, even if the circumstances were complicated. As for Sally, she faced the consequences of her deception in every aspect of her life. The social embarrassment was perhaps the harshest punishment, as mutual friends and family members struggled to understand how she could have maintained such an elaborate lie for so many years. Several long-time friendships ended when people realized they had also been deceived and used as unwitting accomplices in her deception. I maintained a relationship with Holly as a stepfather figure, while respecting Thaddeus's role as her biological father. The transition had been challenging for everyone involved, but the honesty felt like a weight had been lifted from all of our shoulders. The final chapter of my revenge came in the form of a letter I received from Sally's attorney almost a year later. She had been struggling financially since losing the dual support she had been receiving from both Thaddeus and me, and the court-ordered repayment had forced her into bankruptcy. Her carefully planned future had crumbled along with her web of lies, leaving her to rebuild from nothing. I felt no sympathy for her situation. She had made deliberate choices to deceive me for years, stealing not just my money but my sense of reality and my trust in the people I loved most. The consequences she faced were entirely of her own making, and I had simply ensured that the truth finally came to light. Looking back on that birthday party, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Blair had kept her mouth shut for just a few more hours. Would Sally and Thaddeus have eventually revealed the truth on their own timeline? Would I have lived the rest of my life believing Holly was my biological daughter? The questions are fascinating but ultimately irrelevant. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and I'm grateful that it happened when it did. The most important lesson I learned from the entire experience was the power of responding to deception with calculated truth rather than emotional chaos. My methodical investigation and strategic revelation of the facts had been far more devastating to Sally's lies than any angry confrontation could have been. By maintaining my composure and letting the evidence speak for itself, I had given her no opportunity to manipulate the narrative or play the victim. Today, I'm building a new life based on authenticity and honest relationships. I've learned to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right, and I've developed a much lower tolerance for people who prioritize their own convenience over truth and integrity. The experience was painful, but it ultimately freed me from a life built on lies and gave me the opportunity to create something real and meaningful. Holly and I still spend time together regularly, and she's thriving in her relationship with both Thaddeus and me. She's old enough now to understand what happened and why, and she's expressed appreciation for the way I handled a difficult situation with her best interests at heart. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their delusions, even when the truth is painful. As for Sally, she eventually stopped calling. The desperate voicemails and text messages gradually faded as she realized that there was no path back to the life she had built on deception. Our only contact now is through attorneys when issues arise regarding Holly, and even those interactions are minimal and formal. I often think about that moment when I stood up from the fire pit and thanked Blair for finally telling me the truth. In that instant, I had a choice between protecting the comfortable lie or embracing the uncomfortable truth. I chose truth, and while the path forward was difficult, it led to a life of authenticity and integrity that I never could have achieved while living in Sally's web of deception. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply refusing to participate in someone else's lies anymore.